In this training video, we're going to look at the global options in the management console, as well as the services dialog. So this is again what you see when you open the management console. Let's look at the global options right here. So the first option on the top left is the boot time behavior. So there are a few different selections that you can make here. So this controls whether the agent will process events written to the event log while the agent was not running. And there's basically, three levels. The first one being most, meaning that the agent will remember the last event it processed, and then you restart it. It will rescan the event log, basically, go back in time and process those events. The next option is regular. With the regular option, it basically doesn't do any rescans. It just starts on monitoring, as soon as you started, ignoring any events that happened while the agent was stopped, for example, while the server was rebooted. And then the least option, of course, is we're not doing a rescan, and we're actually starting to monitor a little bit later. So, this can be useful if you have a lot of activity, a lot of events happening during boot time. And you don't want to get false alerts about that. So you could say, okay, after, my server or my servers in general, my hosts require about 2 minutes, 120 seconds to boot. So I don't want to get any alerts during that time. And of course, you can also apply this limit only to specific types of actions. So you could say, hey, I don't want to get any emails from my servers for the first 3 minutes. And that's how you would configure that. The default, of course, like I mentioned, is the rescan option all the way on the top. For troubleshooting purposes, if you have a server that's been off for a long period of time, let's say an entire weekend or so, the rescan may take some time and may cause some increased CPU usage. So generally speaking, it tries not to read the logs or process them too fast. But if you ever notice that an agent is using a lot of CPU time right when you started and it's taking too long, then you can temporarily disable this option or set it back to regular, and you should see an improvement at that point. Let's move on to the second option here, the maximum notification interval. So there are a couple of system health packages that send certain alerts in recurring intervals, and you can control this here. Then we have a max temp file size. So if you're not using the collector, and most new installations have the collector enabled by default, so you probably won't need this, but the maximum size controls how much data the agent will be caching if an action is unavailable. So if an agent is talking directly to your database and the database is temporarily unavailable, then it will try to cache data and then rewrite it or resend it to the action, and this is where you control the maximum size of that. When EventSentry detects an issue with disk space or performance monitoring, and if we hover over here, then we see an explanation here, then it will log an event with the selected severity. So if we, in a future video about disk space and performance monitoring, you'll see that when an alert is generated, you can essentially control with which severity you want these events to be logged. It could be an informational, warning, or error. So now by default, when a situation occurs, let's say a host is low in disk space or a performance counter, let's say CPU is too high, it will log it with the severity that you selected, let's say error, and that's good. But when that situation is resolved again, when that CPU counter, let's say, is back to normal, then EventSentry, of course, will log this as well to let you know that everything is okay again, and it will log that with the same severity. So if you selected error, you'll get an error when there's a problem, and another error event when the problem has been resolved. If you don't want that, if you say, I don't want to get another error because that's misleading, I have my own notification rules that will let me know that this is resolved, then you can change this behavior right here, and this will apply to any package. So default obviously leaves whatever the built-in behavior works alone, but you could set this to information here. Naming schema controls how the host names appear in the web reports. So if you just have one domain, then NetBias is usually the best choice. If you have multiple domains, you want a more granular information, then you can set this to the fully qualified domain name, FQDN. So then you'll see, hostname.domain.something. Or you can set it to alias. So you can also assign aliases to computers. And if you set it to that option, then the alias will actually be written to the database. UTC support, that's something for older versions of EventSentry. That's enabled by default and has been enabled by default for many years. But if you're still on an older version, upgrading that, you can, then this is a button that can be pressed to enable UTC support. Agent security options. So as you can see, we have a number of groups here. And when we deploy the configuration or push the configuration to a remote system, they by default get the whole configuration sent to them. If you are an MSP, for example, or you have groups, multiple groups of different locations, different teams taking care of these servers or workstations, and you don't want somebody who opens up the management console on a remote computer or peeks into the registry at a remote computer to see the other groups that you have configured. Again, best scenario usually is an MSP. You may have 30 groups for 30 different customers, and you don't want customer 17 to open up and look into the registry and see all the other groups, all the other customers that you have. So then you would check this box, and at that point, the remote agents will only keep the groups that they are in, and they won't see any other information. We have maintenance schedule options for the agents. So if you know that a host is going to be down during a certain time period, you can set a maintenance schedule either for a fixed date or a recurring date every Wednesday from 5 to 8, for example. And if you want these maintenance schedules to not only apply to heartbeat alerts and availability, but also to actual email alerts, and you can check these boxes here. If you're using the collector and you want to get additional threat intel, and this is especially useful also with the NetFlow feature, then you can get a token from the Abuse IP DB website and paste that in here, and then you can get additional threat intel from that website here. We do by default get threat intel from known blacklists, from free blacklists that are downloaded on a regular basis. But with the Abuse PDB, you can get a little bit more insight. It's a community-sourced threat intelligence database, essentially for IP addresses. And EventSentry also ships with a GeoLite GeoIP database file that does a pretty good job giving you a general idea of where an IP address is located. But you can also upgrade that with the MaxMind website and get a more granular database there. And now let's take a quick look at the services dialog. Here we have all of the components that are currently running in the resource utilization. So you'll see here that the memory usage is pretty low. This is why this, if you have less or more memory usage, then you'll see a bar here. But because this server here has a lot of memory, all the bars are seemingly empty. But if you hover over them, you can see the actual memory usage of each component. You can also toggle the components here, start and stop them, change the logging level here. This is useful when you're having issues and you need to send the logs to our support team. And you can also create test events here. So if you want to force events and see if your filter rules are working, so here you can see this a little bit now. The agent is temporarily using 2% CPU time, so then the graph will appear here. But back to the test events, if you hit this button, then you will get 3 events written to the application event log, 1 with an information, 1 warning, 1 error, and you can use that to test filter rules, for example. And if you press these buttons here, they will create a memory dump for this component. So if you're experiencing issues and support is asking you to create memory dumps, then you can simply click these buttons and that will create the dump files.